Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Whip Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to advance in several areas. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Verkhnokamiansk, east of Siversk. The Russians also managed to expand their control over Chasiv Yar, gaining almost full control over the entire first area south of Chasiv Yar. The Russians have managed to advance in between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, and a lot of advancements were made along the southern and northern flanks of Kurakhove as Russians continue offensive operations west of the city. Starting out near Verkhnokamiansk, the Russians managed to enter the town again. With this geolocated footage, we see that the Russians have restarted offensive operations within the town. And as we saw with the previous attempts by the Russians to gain control over Verkhnokamiansk, the Russians do not have a difficult time gaining full control over the town. They're having a very difficult time holding it. That is due to how many of these buildings are completely destroyed, leaving almost no cover for the Russian forces or Ukrainian forces present within the town. Instead, the fortified positions northwest of Hryhorivka and south of Siversk are the most important objectives for the Russians to gain control of. And then the Ukrainians also have the defensive lines east of Siversk, which act as a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. And with the towns that are completely destroyed, it's almost as if it's just empty fields rather than actual towns. There are some basements that the Ukrainians are present within and that the Russians would want to take over to gain control over the town. But every time the Russians launch an offensive operation to take control of the town, the Ukrainians then respond with a counterattack and regain control over the area. Seen a lot of fighting in the northern and southern flanks of Verkhnokamiansk. The Russians have slowly advanced along the southern flank recently to reach the fortified positions near Encirclement and expand their foothold along the forest lines, expanding their presence and control of the area, while the Ukrainians are constantly shedding any Russian operations across. Therefore, what we can conclude from this is that the Russians are attempting yet another offensive towards Verkhnokamiansk. Not much has changed since the previous one, and this raises the question as to what difference have they included in their operation for it to have a different outcome than the previous ones, but the Russians really just launched a failed push where they took casualties for absolutely no gain because the Ukrainians reversed the gains really quickly. The Ukrainian commander of the Siversk section of the front line has proven to be one of the most, if not the most competent Ukrainian commander this conflict, and therefore the Russians on the eastern side, who keeps repeating the same mistakes, has proven to be one of the worst ones, yet the situation continues in this regard. Let's see if there is a difference this time, or if history will repeat itself yet another time. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to gain control over the bunker area and the remaining defensive positions of the Ukrainians in the first area south of the eastern district. And with this, the Russians continued offensive operations towards the southwestern district of Chasiv Yar to gain full control over the entire city. The Russians, despite the siege of the apartment complex area, are not stopping there and are continuing with the battles on the flanks to gain full control over the city in its entirety on the northern and southern flanks, to then push onwards towards the towns around it and to secure their positions within the city to gain full control of it. The Russians are here continuing offensive operations mainly on the southern flank because that is where their advances have grown to be the smallest. And with these recent days of significant pushes by the Russian forces, it seems that the Ukrainian defenses within Chasiv Yar is collapsing following the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the central parts of the city. And this has led to significant advances by the Russians. And therefore, we can conclude, based on the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the central part of the city, unless the Ukrainian forces send reinforcements very quickly to launch a counterattack and to stabilize the situation, the city of Chasiv Yar may fall within the next few days, which would spell a disaster for the Ukrainian forces in the area. And we can clearly see the difference in the competence of the Russian and Ukrainian commanders in the Chasiv Yar direction with the Siversk direction, but the Russians have managed to consistently advance and launch successful operations from the eastern bank of the canal, gain full control of it, and crossing over and getting a foothold within Chasiv Yar and then pushing through. The Russians have been much more successful than they have been in Siversk front, despite the Siversk front having been fought over for over 2 years now. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to advance towards Novoalexandrivka from the southeast, where they are looking to gain control of additional first lines and slowly push in the direction of the town. The Russians still looking to gain control over Spinivka and the first lines up to Novoalexandrivka to start the attack on that town and then move onwards along the Solona River towards the Dnipropetrovsk region, and also to secure the northern flank for further offensive operations towards Nadivka and along the fortified positions to the south of Novoalexandrivka. The Russians also managed to advance west of Novoalexandrivka, where they're pushing towards Sripny, gaining control over the first lines to the east of it. Now the fighting will move onwards along the first lines to the north, to flank Sripny from the north, and along the first lines to the south to flank it from the south, before a push enters it from the eastern direction and northern and southern directions for a three-pronged attack towards the town that is connected with the town of Zaporizhia. Further south towards the town of Andrivka, the Russians have managed to advance and expand their control within the town itself in the eastern parts and the fortified positions to the north of it. The Russians are here securing the highway towards Andrivka from the north by expanding their control over the fortified areas and moving alongside it to gain control over the northern flank of the town. At the same time, they're entering further into it to cut off the Ukrainian forces in the eastern parts along the fortified positions, and then move onwards along the highway towards the northern flank of Konstantinopel, where we see that the Russians are also storming Konstantinopel area to gain control of the first lines to the south of the town and along the Sukhyali River, where they're fighting alongside the river line and towards Konstantinopel to attack it from the northern direction, and also advancing towards Rusliv from the east. The Russians have managed to continue fighting in the northern and southern flanks of Kurakhove, where they along the Vovty River line and the Sukhyali River line are expanding their zone of control in a westward direction, expanding the size of the pocket in a very long manner, where its size now spans from Dashne in the east to Konstantinopel in the west, and the objective of the Russians is to operationally encircle as many towns and groupings of Ukrainian forces as possible as they have advanced alongside it, while at the same time they make it thinner and thinner as they want to pressure the Ukrainian forces to withdraw out of this pocket along the prepared firing positions of the Russian forces, which will launch heavy attacks on the Ukrainian forces while they are on the move, inflicting as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainian forces. Russians also managed to advance further within Dashne in the southern parts of the town as they look to gain full control of it. They're slowly fighting through the residential area, and with this we see that Dashne is also on its last legs. The Russians will slowly look to push the Ukrainians out of the town, where the Ukrainians will really look to make a last stand, as withdrawing from Dashne would mean entering through open fields and being exposed to firing positions of the Russians in the northern flank. And with the pushes from the southern flank, we may be seeing some being established south of Dashne and Ulekli within the coming days, as the Russians advance along the Sukhyali River line and the first lines to the south, as they close and thin out the pocket itself. With the Russian advances to the west of the river line as well, the Russians are looking to gain full control over the river line, preventing a Ukrainian withdrawal through Ulekli along the river line. The Russians move along the river line towards Konstantinopel to cut off their withdrawal from the southern direction, and with their push through Andrivka to gain control over the northern flank as well, Ulekli would end up in a complete encirclement, as well as everything to the east of it, as Russians will have full control over the northern bank of the river line near the Vovty River and the southern bank of the river line near the Sukhyali River, with a push towards Konstantinopel and Andrivka from the southern and northern direction. The number one rule in warfare is to not let the tips touch, yet they look like they will be touching soon enough. In conclusion, we can see that the Russians continued offensive operations west of Kurakhove as well as to the southwest of Pokrovsk to reach the Dnipropetrovsk border area, where the objective is to gain full control over the southwestern flank of the Donetsk region, concentrate their forces in the direction of Pokrovsk towards the northern direction from the east and western flank of Pokrovsk to operationally encircle the city, and at the same time develop offensive operations between Toretsk and Pokrovsk to encircle additional forces of the Ukrainian army in their defensive capabilities north of Avdiivka, gain control over Chasiv Yar, and connect it with the Toretsk section of the front line to gain a siege of Konstantinivka as well. And now we also see operations in the Siversk direction, as the Russians are looking to push the Ukrainians back out of the Siversk direction and into the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, which will be the main focus of the Ukrainian forces in the coming months, as the Russians will look to gain control over Chasiv Yar, advance alongside the flank, the weakness of the Ukrainian defensive lines east of Kramatorsk, and this is to cut off the Ukrainian positions along Siversk. When the Ukrainians lose their artillery support that they have from the Chasiv Yar direction and alongside the high ground east of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, then the Siversk direction will significantly weaken, as well as the Liman directions, and the Russian offensive operations will pick up their pace in the eastern and northern parts of the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.